Now, I want to start by telling you a story of something that happened to me at work. It's a true story, and it has to do with whales and wells. Kind of sounds the same, and as you're going to find out when someone with a southern accent talks, you can't tell the difference. Anyway, I work at the Conservation Department for New York State, and my job is to regulate the oil and gas wells in western New York. And in our building, we have different divisions. I'm in the division of minerals, which includes oil and gas, but there's also the division of fisheries, the division of wildlife and forestry and so forth. And at any rate, when someone calls the Conservation Department with a question, our receptionist will take the call and direct it to whichever division should handle that question. And anyway, this story has to do with Lake Erie. And I want you to know I drew that picture myself. So. And as you probably know, Lake Erie has an international boundary down through it, and half the lake is owned by Canada and half is owned by the U.S. Now, deep in the rocks, buried underneath Lake Erie, buried in those rocks, there are deposits of oil and gas. However, we do not allow drilling in the waters of Lake Erie due to environmental concerns. So there are no wells drilled in the waters of Lake Erie, at least not on our side of the lake. You see, Canada does allow drilling in Lake Erie. So there have literally been hundreds of wells drilled in Lake Erie, but they're all on the Canadian side of the lake, none on our side. Well, with that in mind, several years ago, there was on one of the Buffalo TV channels, there was, during the news hour, there was this story at the end of the news hour about someone had claimed to have seen a whale swimming in Lake Erie. I don't know what they saw, but they didn't see a whale because whales live in the ocean. I thought everybody knows that. And, but at any rate, I'm sure that the news anchor knew that too, but this is probably one of those tongue-in-cheek stories they put on at the end and had a little fun with it. But at least one gentleman who was watching the news that night took it very seriously because he called our office the next day to see if it was true that there's a whale spotted in Lake Erie. Now, this gentleman had a heavy southern accent. And so when he called our office, Roseanne, our receptionist, said, "Good morning, Conservation Department, can I help you?" And he says, "Yeah, I want to know, is it true that there's a whale in Lake Erie?" He meant whale, but it sounded like well. He says, "Is it true that there's a whale in Lake Erie?" And Roseanne said, "Just a minute, let me transfer you to someone that can help you." And so thinking he was talking about, well, I'm getting mixed up myself, but thinking he was talking about a well, she transferred him to us. So our phone buzzed, and I said, "Good morning, Division of Minerals, can I help you?" And this man with the accent says, "Yeah," he says, "I don't know why she transferred me to you folks. I just want to know, is it true that there's a whale in Lake Erie?" And I said, "Well, sir, there are a lot of wells in Lake Erie, but they're all on the Canadian side of the lake. There's none on our side of the lake." And it's a true story. And he says, "Well, how do you know there's none on our side of the lake?" And I said, "Well, sir, because due to environmental concerns, we do not allow them on our side of the lake." And he thought, and he says, "Well, how do you stop them?" I said, "Well, sir, it's very simple. Wells require permits, so we just don't issue any permits for them. But Canada does. That's why there's so many on their side of the lake." And he says, "Well, this doesn't make any sense." He says, "Are we talking about the same thing?" He says, "I'm talking about whales. You know, whales that blow?" And I said, "Well, yeah, whales can blow, but I'm sure Canada requires equipment installed on them so they can't blow out." True story. Okay, let's talk about creation and evolution. Now, just so everyone knows where I stand, I believe in creation. But I used to believe in evolution. And the reason I believed in evolution was because that's what I was taught in school. You know, you tend to believe what you're taught. And I was taught evolution in a big way. Let me give you an example. This is a book I had to use for a class at Penn State. It was a paleontology class, a study of fossils. And I want to show you something from early on in the book, actually it's on page 38, that kind of set the tone for the entire course. there is no longer any controversy as to whether or not evolution has taken place. The huge and growing mass of data demonstrate decisively the fact of evolution. So that's how I was taught. I was taught that evolution was a fact. Everything that in that course was drawn from the fact of evolution. And so I became a very strong believer in evolution. I can tell you that there is no one on this planet who is more certain of evolution today than I was, because I had absolutely no doubts whatsoever. I was 100% certain that evolution was true. So when I came up with people who did not believe in evolution, I thought they were wrong. So I would try to persuade them to believe in evolution. And if they would not believe in evolution, sometimes I would poke fun at them. I can remember poking fun at my wife Sandy because she believed in creation. I thought I had all the answers because, well, I'd been taught so much science. But then one day, I found out some things in science that bothered me. These things bothered me not just because they were evidence against evolution, but because I had not been taught them. You see, I thought I had been given both sides of this issue. It turns out I wasn't. And so that raised red flags with me. And so, as a result, over the next 3 years, I began an intensive study on this subject where I read several books and probably 100 scientific articles on evolution. And as a result, during that 3-year period, my belief in evolution, which was way up here, gradually started to crumble. And my belief in creation, which was non-existent, gradually started to build up. You might say that during that 3-year period, I gradually evolved into a creationist. Now, just what is evolution? You know, so many people say they believe in evolution, but just what is evolution? You know, when they take a poll, like the Gallup poll, it's pretty consistent that 1 out of 2 Americans will say, I believe in evolution. So what is this evolution that half of America says they believe in? Well, the best place I know to find out what evolution is to go to the original source. This book is called The Origin of Species, and it was written by Charles Darwin in 1859. And it was with this book that Darwin first presented his theory of evolution to the world. So let's see in Darwin's own words what evolution is. Therefore, I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form. So, according to Darwin, the father of evolution, all life on this planet, past and present, descended from a single form of life that lived long ago. I found the modern version of this definition in the Buffalo newspaper. Bacteria are the oldest and simplest living creatures and are the common ancestor of all plants and animals. So, according to evolution, all life on this planet, past life and present life, all life descended from a single microscopic bacterial cell that lived long ago. That's why I like to call evolution the bacteria to man theory, because that is exactly what evolution says. Evolution says that microscopic bacteria, like you see magnified on this sharp point of a pin, has changed over time into people. Well, now there's a handsome young man. Now, according to evolution, he came from that. Of course, another way of looking at it is to say that my grandparents, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were bacteria. Of course, if evolution is true, I had other types of grandparents between me and Grandpa bacteria. Actually, if evolution is true, all of you had different types of grandparents between you and your Grandpa bacteria. If evolution is true, you all had grandparents who were rodents, and you had grandparents who were lizards, and you had grandparents who were fish. If evolution is true, then all of us had a whole series of grandparents leading from us all the way back to that great granddaddy of us all, that very first bacterial cell that lived long ago. That is what evolution is. And let's not forget, that's just the grandparents. But remember, evolution says that you are also related to all life on the planet today. All life. unless you think I'm exaggerating, let me show you a quote from Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was one of the most famous evolution scientists who ever lived. Wrote many books on evolution, hosted a TV series that was about evolution, and he was once voted the smartest man in America by the readers of Parade magazine. So let me show you what the smartest man in America wrote in his book. An oak tree and I are made of the same stuff. If you go far enough back, we have a common ancestor. So, according to Sagan, and he's right, if evolution is true, trees are your relatives. I don't know if it would be proper to call trees your blood relatives because trees don't have any blood, but I suppose you could call trees your sap relatives. So as you can see, evolution is all about change. According to evolution, bacteria changed to people and everything else along the way. But how about creation? Do creationists also believe things change? Or do creationists believe that things were just created and just kind of remain the same thereafter? Because that's what evolutionists teach about us. And I'm going to show you proof of that. I'm going to show you several examples where evolution scientists teach that creationists, that we believe that things were created and just stayed the same, basically the same. But first, let me set the record straight. Do creationists really believe things don't change over time? Let's find out. I'm sure that some of you are creationists. And if you're a creationist, then you must believe that everyone in this room descended from the same two people. So to find out whether or not creationists believe things change over time, I want you to look around the room and see if you can find someone who looks different than you. Does that not prove that creationists believe things change over time? And if you don't think you look enough different from the person next to you, compare yourself to a person of a different race. Creationists have always believed that all people, all races, descended from the same two people. So of course creationists believe things change over time. As a matter of fact, creationists believed that things changed long before the theory of evolution was ever invented by man. Here's a picture I took that shows some change that creationists believe in. This is a picture of our three sons. Now, they're a lot older now, but even at this young age, you can see there's a lot of differences among them. But why is that? They have the same mom and dad. So shouldn't they all look exactly alike? Why don't they? Well, one possibility we could consider is that these boys of ours are mutants. You know, Sandy and I have talked about this, and we don't think our boys are mutants. Actually, I'm going to be speaking a lot about mutations in a little bit tonight. But the reason these boys look different from each other is because of when they got their genes. You know the genes that are in our DNA? When they got their genes from Sandy and me, half from each of us, they each got our genes shuffled up in different ways. You see, creation scientists teach that each one of us has a huge number of genes in our DNA, and that these genes can be shuffled up in a huge number of ways, which allows for a huge amount of change to take place within our kind. But the important thing to remember is that every gene, every individual gene in these boys' DNA can also be found in my DNA or in Sandy's DNA. So you see, there's no new genes here. It's just the same old genes shuffled up in different ways. And just like there is a limit to how many ways you can shuffle a deck of cards, right? There's not an infinite number of ways to shuffle a deck of cards. So just like there's a limit to how many ways you can shuffle a deck of cards, there has to be a limit to how many ways you can shuffle the genes. Therefore, there has to be a limit to how much change you can get by shuffling the genes. Let me show you another picture I took. These are both full-grown dogs. Buster was a full-grown boxer, belonged to a friend, and Augie, a full-grown Chihuahua, belonged to my sister. Now, do you think that creationists believe that these two dogs, even though they're so different from each other, share common ancestors? Well, let's find out. According to creationists, how many dogs got on Noah's Ark? 2. According to creationists, how many dogs got off Noah's Ark? 2. Or more. I guess we don't know how many got off because they were on there for over a year, just over a year, so we don't really know how many dogs got off the ark, but we do know that only 2 dogs got on the ark, which means all the dogs in the world today descended from just 2 dogs that got on the ark. What does that prove? Well, that proves that creationists have always believed in a tremendous amount of change accumulating over the generations. Look at the change you can see from this single picture I took. You got a small dog and a big dog. That is quite a change. But there's more than just size difference. Take a look. You got a pointed snout and a flat snout. Long fur, short fur, pointed ears, floppy ears, red bow, no red bow. Well, okay. Forget the red bow because, as you know, red bows have nothing to do with genetics. But there's many other changes. But all those other changes I mentioned are genetic changes, and there's many other genetic changes that are not so evident from the picture. The point is, this single photograph I took proves that creationists have always believed in a tremendous amount of change accumulating over the generations, contrary to what evolutionists teach about us. So today we have over 300 varieties of domestic dogs. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors and temperaments. And don't forget the wild dogs. You have all the different species of coyotes, wolves, jackals, dingoes, and all of them descended from just 2 dogs, according to creationists. So the creation theory goes like this. God created different kinds of plants and animals, and He gave each kind the genetic ability to change. Why? So they could adapt to different environments. But the potential for change is small compared to what evolutionists believe. Small. Now, you've heard me say over and again that creationists believe in a tremendous amount of change. Well, they do, we do, but it's still small compared to what evolutionists believe. Remember, evolutionists believe that bacteria changed into people. Creationists believe in nothing of the sort. So, to compare the two theories, evolution versus creation, when you talk about our grandparents that lived in the past, evolution says that some of our grandparents, some of your grandparents who lived long ago were rodents. Some of them were lizards. Some of them were fish. But creationists say, no. Creationists say our grandparents were people, all of them. No matter how far back we go, every one of our grandparents was a person, according to creation. And when you talk about our cousins that are alive on the earth today, evolution says that some of your distant cousins that are actually alive on the earth today are trees. Some are grasshoppers, some are snails, and so forth. But creation says, no way. Creation says all of our cousins alive on the earth today are people. No matter how distantly related they are, every one of our cousins today is a person, according to creation. So you can see there's quite a difference between these two theories. And let me tell you, to believe in evolution, you must be taught evolution, because otherwise, you'd never believe it. Let me give you an illustration why I say that. When our youngest son was 3 years old, I had recently become a creationist. I had recently given up on the theory of evolution. And so I thought, well, you know, Troy's 3 years old. I think it's time that he started to learn a little bit about evolution. That way, I can teach him both sides of the issue instead of the way that I was taught. So as I was tucking Troy in bed one night, he's lying in bed with his head on his pillow. And I sat down in the bed and I said, Troy, I want to tell you something. Daddy used to believe in evolution. And that 3-year-old said something very profound. He said, Daddy, what is evolution? Good question, right? So I said, well, Troy, you know, I'm your daddy, but who's my daddy? He says, Grandpa. I said, that's right, Grandpa. But who is Grandpa's daddy? And he thinks, and I had to help him. I said, well, Grandpa's daddy died a long time ago, but Grandpa had a daddy because everybody has to have a daddy. And so I said, well, Grandpa had a daddy, and Grandpa's daddy, he had to have a daddy, and that daddy had a daddy, and that daddy had a daddy, and that daddy had a... So I just kind of took him back through time so you could see that the daddies just keep going back and back and back and back. And then I said to him, well, Troy, when I believed in evolution, I believed that if you went back enough those daddies, went way back, that some of those daddies a long, long time ago were fish. And he gets this horrible look on his face of confusion, actual kind of like pain. I'm thinking, what have I done? But then that look on his face suddenly turned to great big grin. And that 3-year-old boy with his head on his pillow looked up at me and says, "Daddy is joking." You know, if you want, you can teach a 3-year-old that come late December, a big man in a red suit is going to crawl down every chimney in the world in one night. And he'll believe that. Or you can teach them that come March or April, a big rabbit's going to sneak in the house and hide colored eggs all over it. And he'll believe that. But try to teach him evolution. Not so easy. Which brings us to this question. How do schools convince their students that evolution is true? Well, I can answer this question from experience because the schools did a really good job of convincing me that evolution is true, and they do a really good job of convincing millions of others. And see, looking back, thinking back how I was taught, looking at my notes, my books, I realize now what they did is they use a strategy. And the strategy goes like this. First, they try to convince students that only evolutionists believe living things change over time. In other words, they teach that creationists believe things do not change over time. And if they convince students of that, they got them. They've got them, because then all they have to do is present any example of change, no matter how small, as evidence of evolution, because only evolutionists believe in change. Let me give you some examples where this strategy is employed. I brought with me this evening a stack of books from my collection at home. These are textbooks that have been used in schools. One of them is a book that I had used for a biology course that I took right at JCC. Another book is a book that my sister had to use when she took biology at St. Bonaventure. Another book is a book that my co-worker used when he was in college. And one of them, by the way, is the identical book to a book that our oldest son had to use in 7th grade science class at Allegheny Limestone Central School. Now, I'm going to show you an example from each one of these books where the evolution scientist who authored the book is trying to convince the students that creationists believe things do not change over time. First book. Creationists believe that, quote, each species of plant and animal was created separately and remained unchanged thereafter. Is that what creationists believe? No. Creationists don't believe that. Think about it. If that was true, every one of you would look like either Adam or Eve. And all dogs would look alike. That's not what creationists believe. Creationists never believed that. Remember, creationists believe things changed before evolution was even invented. Next book. Creationists believe that all modern organisms are essentially unchanged descendants of the created ancestors. Wrong. That's not what creationists believe. They never believe that. Creationists believe in unchanging forms of life, individually made by the Creator. Wrong. Creationists believe that living things didn't change through time. Wrong. Creationists believe that each species was separately created and once formed did not change from one generation to the next. Wrong. That is not what creationists believe. Creationists never believe that. Remember, creationists believe things changed before evolution was even invented. So why are they misleading the students like this? Why don't they just teach the students the truth about creation? Because the truth does not fit their strategy. Their strategy is to convince students that only evolutionists believe in change, so then they can present any example of change, no matter how small, as evidence of evolution. So the books have all these examples of little changes that are supposed to be evidence for evolution over creation. And I want to tell you, it's not just in the textbooks that this dishonest strategy is employed. Here's a popular news magazine, U.S. News and World Report. It's read by millions of people every week. And this issue, there's this article about fruit flies. The title of the article is Darwin as Fit as Ever. And it has a subtitle called Evolution in Action. In this article, they claim to have documented an actual example of evolution taking place in nature. Now, what could be better evidence of evolution than that? An actual example of evolution taking place. So let's see what this huge evolutionary change was that they documented. Let's make sure that it's a change that's big enough that creationists would not also accept. Because as any good scientist knows, when you are comparing two theories, which is what's being done in this article, then evidence that fits both theories is not evidence in favor of either theory. All good scientists know that. So let's see what this huge evolutionary change was. Let's see what these fruit flies changed into. School boards and politicians may have their doubts about the theory of evolution, but out in the natural world, Darwin keeps winning hands down. Fruit flies have evolved a pattern of size differences. Flies at the northern end of the range have wings about 4% longer than those in the south. Wow! Those fruit flies' wings changed by a whopping 4% in size. No wonder they say this is evidence for evolution over creation, because certainly creationists would never believe that something could change in size by 4%, would they? Ladies and gentlemen, if creationists believe that dogs have changed this much through selection, and creationists do believe that dogs have changed this much through selection, then don't you think they would believe that fruit flies' wings could change by measly 4% through selection? My question would be, why would the editors of this news magazine print such a ridiculous article? Well, I asked the question, but I think I know the answer. I have little doubt that the editors of this magazine went through the same type of schools that I went through and were taught the same rubbish that I was taught, that only evolutionists believe in change. And so when they had this article presented to them, they probably thought, wow, a change. That is evolution. Let's print this article. Go figure. You know, when I first read this article, it got me thinking about my feet. Now, I know it sounds silly, but the shoes that I wear are size 12. But guess what? The shoes that my dad wears, size 9. You know what that means? That means that in one generation, Miller's feet have gone from size 9 to size 12. Well, that's a whole lot more than a 4% change. So you suppose the editors of this magazine would be willing to print an article about the evolution of Miller's feet? Probably not. Okay, what causes dogs and other living things to accumulate changes over the generations? Because you see how different dogs are today. They certainly didn't get that way in a single generation. Somehow, when the genes get shuffled and cause those little variations to occur, somehow, some of those variations have to be selected out and saved so they can accumulate over future generations. Now, that process by which certain variations are selected out and saved is simply called selection. And it comes in two varieties, artificial selection and natural selection. But as you'll see, they're really the same thing. The only difference is that with artificial selection, people select which variations are going to be saved and accumulated. But with natural selection, nature selects which variations are going to be saved and accumulated. But in both situations, in both cases, the genes get shuffled, cause little variations to occur, and selection, one or the other, selects which some of those variations to be saved so they can accumulate. So they're subject to the same limitations, and you can learn about one by studying the other. Now let me go over an example of each one of these so you'll see that they really are the same thing. Artificial selection. Start with that. You probably know artificial selection better as selective breeding. They're the same thing. Artificial selection and selective breeding are one and the same thing. They're just two terms for the same thing. And selective breeding has been going on for thousands of years. It's been going on for thousands of years before Darwin was even born. That's why there were thoroughbred dogs, whole bunches of different types of thoroughbred dogs in existence when Darwin was born. Because people had been using artificial selection for centuries and centuries and centuries. That's how the dogs got to be that way. It's also one of the reasons that fruits and vegetables in the grocery stores look so much better than the wild varieties, because people have practiced selection on fruits and vegetables for so long to get them that way. But the example of artificial selection I want to go over in some detail has to do with guppies, because guppies are my favorite example. Because you see, I've had guppies on and off since I was a small child. Even today, we have a 55-gallon aquarium in our basement with nothing at all in the aquarium except guppies. Well, there's water in it, the fish have to swim. But I've always been fascinated by guppies because, first of all, unlike most fish that lay eggs, guppies don't lay eggs. Guppies are live bearers. And boy, do guppies bear. A single female guppy will have 20 to 30 babies every month. So guppies are real easy to multiply and real easy to practice selection on. Now this is a male guppy, as you would find in the wild. But here's what you'll find in the fish store. In the fish store, they call these fancy guppies. But fancy guppies came from wild guppies just by selection. People use selection on the wild guppies. Again, for instance, the wild guppy has different colors in it. But sometimes people prefer guppies to be all one color. So what they'll do is they'll pick out a certain color, like orange for instance, and they'll select out the ones that have the most orange and breed them. And then they'll wait and see if the next generation has some with a little more orange, and they'll select the ones with the most orange. They'll just keep doing that. Every generation they select out the ones with the most orange until finally they're going to be all orange. Same thing with the tails. The wild guppy has a narrow tail, but people sometimes prefer wide tail guppies. So what they've done is they've selected out the widest tails and just keep doing it until they get the tails to be so wide they can't even swim straight because they can't hold their tails up. You know, I work at the conservation department, as I mentioned, and over the years I've had a couple friends there who were into tropical fish, much more so than I ever was. And they each had a fish room in their basement where they had a room that was lined with rows of aquariums. And what they would do is they'd choose a particular type of tropical fish they wanted to work with, and then using a series of aquariums, they'd practice selection on them. And once they got that type of fish to be the shape, size, and color that they thought would sell really well, then they would mass produce the end product and sell them in the fish stores. I don't know if you realize it or not, but in the fish stores that sell tropical fish, a lot of those tropical fish look like they do because people have practiced selection on them in their basements. My point is, selection is very easy to do. Anyone can do it, and people have been doing it for thousands of years. Any one of you can practice selection. And if you do, you will find that you can get a lot of change to take place real quick and real easy. So that's artificial selection, where people select the variations that are going to be saved so they can accumulate. Now that compares with natural selection. Now natural selection is the same thing as artificial selection, except that instead of nature selecting which variations are going to be saved, nature selects which variations are going to be saved. You might wonder, well, how does nature select variations to be saved? Well, the best way I can explain it is to give a hypothetical example. Let's say you have two deer grazing in a field, and out of the nearby woods comes a hungry predator. He wants to catch one of the deer and eat it for supper. So the predator starts chasing after the deer, and the deer take off running. But eventually, the predator catches up to one of the deer and kills it. Now, which deer gets killed, the faster deer or the slower deer? Well, the slower deer, of course. And which deer gets away? The faster deer. Now, what does that mean for the deer population as a whole? What it means is the fast deer, just because she was fast, got away and can therefore go on and have more kids and therefore pass on her fast variation into the deer population. How about the slow deer? Can she pass on her slow variation? Oh, no, she's dead. No, her slow variation stops right there. You know, I got thinking that's why you never see slow deer out there. It really is, because for deer, being fast is an advantage. So selection is always trying to save the fast variation. So there you have the two selection processes, artificial selection and natural selection. Remember, they are identical except for who's doing the selecting. And since they are identical, they're subject to the same limitations, and you can learn about one by studying the other. Now, since both creation and evolution teach that selection accumulates variations over time, what is the difference between the two theories? Well, I think you all know. With evolution, evolutionists say that the variations will just keep coming forever and ever, and therefore selection can keep accumulating them forever. But with creation, creationists say, no, those variations are limited because there's only so many ways you can shuffle the genes, which is what causes the variations to occur in the first place. So you cannot change fish into people no matter how much you shuffle up the genes. Now, when you look at a litter of puppies, you'll notice that there's small variations among them. But why are there variations among them? Well, we know why. It's because each puppy got mom's and dad's genes shuffled up in a different way. But you know what? Darwin didn't know that. That was in 1859. No one even knew what genes were. Darwin, just like everyone, knew that there were variations in a litter of puppies. And Darwin, just like everyone at that time, knew that people had been practicing selection on puppies for thousands of years. But Darwin, just like everyone, was completely ignorant of what caused those little variations to occur. He even admitted that in his book. I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if the variations have been due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation. So, but even though Darwin admittedly had no idea what caused variations to occur, he nevertheless assumed, he made the huge assumption that there is no limit to those variations. Let me show you, also from this book. Slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do so much by the powers of artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change which may be effected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection. So, what was Darwin's big assumption? That there is no limit to change. And that assumption was the basis of his entire theory of evolution. Without that assumption, his theory was a non-starter, and he knew it. He knew it, and so he defended this assumption with all his might. And the way he defended it was to attack the competition, to attack the opposite assumption. Let me show you also from his book. It has often been asserted, but the assertion is quite incapable of proof, that the amount of variation under nature is a strictly limited quantity. Well, that's true. Creationists, that's what he's saying. He says those creationists, they assume that variations are limited, but they can't prove that. Well, he was right, but he couldn't prove his assumption either. So what he really had was an argument between two assumptions, and that argument continues today. So the question we want to address is, which of these two assumptions does the evidence support? Because that's what this all gets down to, this scientific evidence. Which does it support? Does it support limited change like creationists believe, or does it support unlimited change like evolutionists believe? Well, let's find out. Let's start with Luther Burbank. Luther Burbank was known as the greatest artificial selector of all time. You probably have had some of his products that he developed with selection, because McDonald's Corporation has historically used Burbank potatoes in most of their French fries. And so if you've had French fries from McDonald's, you've probably eaten some of Burbank's inventions, or whatever you want to call it, but it's potatoes that he developed using selection. Now, but according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Luther Burbank developed over 800 new types of plants, including 113 new types of plums. If anybody knew their plums, it was Luther Burbank. If anyone who knew how much change you could get through selection, or if there's any limit to how much change you can get using selection, it was Luther Burbank. He devoted his life trying to change things using selection. And look what he said. I know from my experience that I can develop a plum ½ an inch long or one 2½ inches long with every possible length in between. But I'm willing to admit that it is hopeless to try to get a plum the size of a small pea or one as big as grapefruit. In short, there are limits to developments possible. Limits. This man who devoted his entire life trying to change things with selection says one thing he found out through his life's work is that there's a limit to how much change you can get. He went so far as to say it is hopeless to try to go beyond the limits of change. Now, why is it hopeless to go beyond the limits of change? Because there's only so many ways you can shuffle the genes, which is what causes the variations to occur in the first place. So, of course, it's hopeless to go beyond the limits of change. But I don't think you need Luther Burbank to tell you that. You could find out yourself. You could go practice selection on something. You could practice selection on some guppies. Get some guppies and practice selection on them. And see if you can get those guppies to change into something. See if you can get those guppies to change into anything except guppies. Good luck with that. No one else has been able to. Or you could talk to someone that has a PhD in horticulture and has done research in horticulture his entire life. See if he knows of any example where anyone has ever been able to get one organism to change into a new organism. Or talk to someone that has a PhD in animal husbandry and has done research in that his entire life. See if he knows of any examples. Talk to anyone you want. Read any place you want to read. Try anything you want. Ladies and gentlemen, no matter what you try, who you talk to, where you look, you will not find a single example where anyone, anywhere, has ever succeeded in getting one organism to change into a new organism. It just has not happened. So as you can see, the evidence is a slam dunk. The evidence supports limited change. It does not support, and never has supported, unlimited change. But you might be wondering, well, okay, but what about lab experiments? Because after all, when scientists come up with a theory, don't they run to the laboratory and design real fancy experiments to try to prove their theory true? Absolutely. And that's exactly what they did with evolution. Ever since Darwin came up with this theory of evolution 154 years ago, scientists have been busy in the laboratory trying to prove evolution true, trying to prove that one organism can indeed change into a new organism. But every experiment they ever tried has failed to do so. But after about 50 years of that, they started to wise up. They said, hey, this is not working. Darwin promised us that one organism could change into a new organism, but our experiments do not bear that out. We need something new. We need something different. We need something to supply new information. So they came up with this idea of mutations. By the way, mutations are simply copy mistakes, in the DNA. Each generation has to make copies of its DNA to pass on to the next generation. And if they make a copy mistake, that's called a mutation. That's all a mutation is. It's a copy mistake in the DNA. And so evolution scientists came up with this theory that maybe mutations supplied all the huge amount of complex information that would be required to change bacteria into people and everything else. In other words, what they're proposing is that you are the current end products of billions of mistakes. So they ran to the laboratory to try to prove this theory true. They conducted mutation experiments, and they've been doing mutation experiments for over 100 years now. They usually use fruit flies because they have a short gestation period, about 12 days. That way they get a quick turnaround in their experiments. In an effort to get fruit flies to mutate, they've hit them with radiation, heat, chemicals, pressure, anything they think of to get fruit flies to mutate. And in that respect, they've been very successful because they've succeeded in getting millions of fruit flies to mutate in the laboratory. Of course, through all of that, what have they gotten those fruit flies to change into, to mutate into? Fruit flies. millions of mutated fruit flies. They haven't even gotten fruit flies to change into a housefly. Just fruit flies. Even when they combined it with selection, so mutations plus selection, they haven't even gotten a better fruit fly. Think about that. 100 years of experiments with mutations plus selection, and they haven't even gotten a better fruit fly. So as you can see, in spite of all the hype you hear about mutations, as it turns out, mutations have not helped evolution in the least. They're still back to where they were 154 years ago, a theory that is not supported by the facts. And what are the facts? No experiment with selection and mutations has ever produced more than a relatively small amount of change, which is exactly what the creation theory predicts. And in spite of millions of attempts over many decades by thousands of scientists, no one has ever succeeded in changing one organism into a new organism. So as you can see, if people believe in evolution, they just have to believe in it because the facts do not support evolution. Okay, can we have both? I often get asked that. Can we be logical about it and still say we believe in both the Bible and in evolution? Well, the answer is no. And the reason it's no is because they contradict each other. Evolution and the Bible contradict each other. So it's not logical to say you believe in both. They contradict each other in many ways. Let me just show you a couple of ways. Evolution says that animals evolved into existence, and then they roamed the earth for millions of years until finally, after millions of years, the first bird evolved into existence. But that's not what God says. God says that He made birds before any of the land animals. And where does He say that? On the first page of His Word. Isn't that cool? I think that's really neat. God destroys the theory of evolution with the first page of His Word. Another example. Evolution says that there was life in the sea for 3 billion years before the first tree ever evolved into existence. But that's not what God says. God says He made trees before any of the life in the sea. And where does He say that? Also on the first page of His Word. You know, they say that you cannot judge a book by its cover. And that's true. But to some degree, you can judge a book by its first page. Because if you are convinced, if you're absolutely convinced that there's huge mistakes on the first page of a book, how can you trust anything in the rest of the book? Well, that's where I was. Because in my mind, evolution was true. I had absolutely no doubts of it. I was 100% certain that evolution was true. So when I saw the first page of the Bible contradicted evolution, I couldn't trust anything in the book because I was convinced there were glaring errors on the first page. So I didn't know what was true and what wasn't true in the rest of the book. But then when I eventually found out that evolution was a false theory, I had to go back to God and say, God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, God, because I believe the smartest men in the world. I believe the word of the smartest men in the world instead of the word of you, the all-knowing God. And I told God I was sorry. I remember doing it. I told God I was sorry. And I told God that I would not make that mistake again. So ever since that day, I've believed the entire Word of God. Let's talk a minute about the first life. How simple was the first life? You know, evolutionists say that life began at some point in the past, just by chance. Everything came together to form the first life. And then once it formed, then it evolved into all these other things like everything else. And but wouldn't you expect the first life to be pretty simple? That's the very beginning of life. With the first life, you expect to be quite simple. How simple is it? Well, you saw that quote early on that I showed, that evolution scientists believe that bacteria are the oldest and simplest form of life. So just how simple is bacteria? You know, when you look at a bacterial cell under a regular microscope, it looks kind of simple. It just looks like a dot. But today, with electron microscopes that magnify millions of times, we're able to open up that dot and look inside of it. And it turns out it's not so simple after all. It turns out it could be better described as a thriving city. And that's not my analogy, by the way. That's evolution scientists themselves today sometimes compare the workings of a bacterial cell to that of a human city. And the reason for that is because just like a human city, this bacterial city, I'll call it, has factories in it. Factories that pump out thousands of products every second. And in addition to that, there's import-export systems because these factories need raw materials. So these import-export systems, they only let certain raw materials in, the ones they need, and keep out the ones that are bad for them. So they only let certain raw materials in, and then they push waste products out. They don't push out waste products that they can recycle, because a lot of that goes on in this city too, but they push out everything they can't use anymore. And also there's a maintenance department that goes around and looks for things that are broken and fixes them. And there's a reproduction department. I won't even get into that yet, but that's pretty complex by itself. All this requires power to run. Where does it get its power from? Where does a human city get its power from? Well, it gets from power plants, right? Same thing here. This city has power plants in it. Power plants to generate the power it needs to run the factories, to run the import-export system, to run the maintenance department, to run the reproduction department, a whole bunch of processes going on all over this city. And that their power plants generate the power needed for all that. But there's some differences between this city and a human city. In a human city, every factory and so forth has foremen to tell the workers what to do. But in this city, there's no foreman to tell the workers what to do. In fact, there's no workers. This whole city runs by itself. There's nobody to push any buttons. There's no buttons to push. Everything, all the factories, import-export system, power plants, reproduction department, everything runs by itself. It's all pre-programmed, just keep running by itself. And that's not all. This city, unlike a human city, can make a copy of itself. Yeah. And how long does it take to make a copy of a city that is more complex than a human city? 20 minutes. 20 minutes to make a copy of an entire city that is more complex than a human city. 20 minutes. It's just mind-boggling. As it turns out, the simplest form of life, what evolutionists say is the first and simplest form of life, is by far more complex than anything the mind of man has ever invented or developed. This simplest of life absolutely puts to shame anything we've ever been able to develop. As a human, I am absolutely humbled to see how complex the simplest of life is. Now, what do evolution scientists say about this? Because remember, evolution scientists believe that the first life just came together by chance. All the millions of parts that make up the first life just all came together in just the right places and all put together just like that. Well, let's find out. Here's an example. Christian Duvet, he's an evolution scientist. He believed it all came together by chance. He's a microbiologist. He's also a Nobel Prize winner, which means, by human standards, he's one of the wisest men in the world because he won a Nobel Prize. So what's he say about how the first life came together? Well, let me show you. Quote, if you equate the probability of the birth of a bacterial cell to that of the chance assembly of its component atoms, even eternity will not suffice to produce one for you. What's he saying? He says it's impossible. He says it's impossible to happen by chance. He says even if you have eternity, it cannot happen by chance. But then look what he says. So you might as well accept, as do most scientists, that the process was completed in no more than 1 billion years. Wait a minute. He just got done saying it's impossible to happen by chance. Then he says, so just accept it. Accept the impossible. Why would a scientist say to just accept the impossible? Because as an evolutionist, he has no choice. No choice. If the first life did not come together by chance, how else could it have happened? In the same interview, he was asked, Dr. Duvet, do you think that maybe God had some role in the beginning of life? And here's how he answered that question. The answer of modern molecular biology to this much debated question is categorical. Chance and chance alone did it all, from primeval soup to man. I call that a statement of faith. And that's from one of the wisest men in the world. You know what God thinks about the wisdom of this world? He says it's foolishness. Let me show you. 1 Corinthians 3:19, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. Foolishness. You know, I found out a long time ago when I was going through my 3-year transition period, as the evidence built up against evolution, as I did all these studies, and I found out the evidence was building up against evolution and favoring creation, I had a choice to make. I knew that if I followed where the evidence was taking me, that I had to reject evolution. But I knew that would make me look foolish to the world. You know, I was deeply involved in the science, and I worked with a lot of scientists, and I knew that all the wise, well, not all, but most of the wisest men in this world were believers in evolution. So I knew I was going to go against the grain if I followed this evidence, and I knew that I would look foolish to the world. But my other choice was to continue to embrace evolution in spite of the evidence, but then I would look foolish to God. That was a choice I had to make. And so I eventually followed the evidence and rejected evolution.